All right, so I just wanted to do a brief introduction to There since we have a snow day today. And just keep up with the reading, okay? And so whatever we have assigned for Tuesday, make sure you have that read by next Tuesday, all right? Okay, so I just wanted to look at the reading guide just to sort of make sure that we're on track and we understand what Tommy Orange is doing in this novel. Okay, remember one of the things we're doing in the class is talking about why people tell the stories that they tell. Okay, so first of all, it seems to me that the purpose of the prologue is to provide basically a really brief outline of some of the sort of more dismal events in Native American history. Um, Basically, it comes down to genocide, as Tommy Orange says, and to talk about sort of historical misconceptions about the past. And he seems to use this motif of what he calls on page 6 the rolling head. He talks a lot about Indian heads on coins, on the test pattern, in films, heads being decapitated, with the idea that that's sort of all that's left, right? Okay. And so one of the things he does then is he tries to, again, sort of correct some misconceptions about, for instance, Thanksgiving. Again, with this motif of rolling heads that he follows throughout the prologue, he talks about an old Cheyenne story about this rolling head that sort of keeps haunting and following uh, this person around. And it seems to me it's kind of a metaphor for Europeans, right, who invaded America. Um, and then he kind of traces, again, very briefly, the Relocation Act, the termination policy directed toward American Indians, and then finally where Indians have ended up as urban Indians. And I have here just a couple images that you guys might not be familiar with. I barely remember the Indian head test pattern from, I don't know when this went off the air, but there that is, in case you're wondering what he's talking about. He also mentions, again, the way in which Thanksgiving is often idealized in American culture. This is one of the more famous paintings depicting Thanksgiving, and in which, the first Thanksgiving, it was American Indians that really kind of were saving the Pilgrims, and on the next, Thanksgiving, Indians were massacred. He also refers to some, again, other popular images in film and TV. And some of the movies that you probably have not seen, you might have Dances with Wolves with Kevin Costner, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And then this, I do remember this commercial, there's a link there if you want to follow it, but about pollution. And this Iron Eyes Cody played the Indian, and he was actually an Italian American. And finally, I'm from California, and I went to school in Berkeley, which is close to Oakland, so I know this area well. And Oakland has a lot of street violence. And so some of the places he talks about, like International Avenue or Boulevard, they've changed the name. I think they're changing it back now. But these are just some images of Oakland. Okay, so one of the things that he's doing in that Orange is doing in the novel is he's introducing us to a bunch of characters, different characters, and their fates will eventually kind of interconnect at the end. They're all going to a powwow, okay? And we know that from the very first chapter. And you've probably already seen ways in which their stories kind of weave together. For instance, Dean Oxendine, on page 32, his uncle knows a woman called Opal Bearshields, right? And then in the very next chapter, we're introduced to Opal Bearshields, okay? And so we will see how Orange is showing how, Indians are still really a tight community, right? Despite the fact that they've been scattered. Okay, just very quickly, Tony Loneman is the first character that we're introduced to. He has fetal alcohol, or he's suffering from the effects of fetal alcohol syndrome. And he says it prevents him on page 19 from being seen. He says, maybe I'm going to do something one day and everybody's going to know about me. Maybe that's when I'll come to life. Maybe that's when they'll finally be able to look at me because they'll have to. Dean Oxendine is the next character. He suffers, all the characters are wounded in some way. But Dean Oxendine suffers from what he calls self-loathing. He says sometimes he feels like throwing himself onto the train tracks, but he says he'd probably mess it up and just hurt, it's not funny, and just hurt his face. He's a kid who does the lens. He writes lens as a tag. There's a motif of seeing, right? Wanting to be seen, wanting to see things, right, from a native point of view throughout the novel. And most importantly, he, like the other characters, sort of recognizes the importance of stories. He says on page 40, we haven't seen the urban Indian story. What we've seen is full of the kinds of stereotypes that are the reason no one is interested in the native story, because it's too sad. So sad it can't even be entertaining. But more importantly, because of the way it's been portrayed, it looks pathetic, right? And so what he wants to do with this videotape project that he takes over from his uncle, Lucas, who dies from alcoholism, is to basically tell modern native urban Indian stories. Okay, Opal Viola Victoria Bearshield is introduced to us next. Her life seems to be marked by dislocation and poverty. Her mother has been abused by at least one husband that we know of. But one thing that her mother passes on to her again is this idea of stories on page 58. Her mother tells her, and so this is about 10 lines from the top, and so what we could do had everything to do with being able to understand where we came from, what happened to our people, and how to honor them by living right, by telling our stories. She told me the world was made of stories, nothing else, just stories and stories about stories. And then, as if it was all leading up to when she was going to say next, my mom paused, a long pause, looked off toward the city, and then told me she had cancer. One of the things that these characters have in common, the first four characters, this was on the original quiz, is that they all lack mothers. At least these first four. Father figures or fathers. The first four. Okay, and then of course Opal also loses her mother. All right, finally Edwin Black we're introduced to. He's the poor guy who has gained 100 pounds since he's finished his master's degree. He is blocked, both physically but also creatively, or stuck, as he says. And he begins to become unstuck in a couple of different ways at the end when his mother suggests maybe he can get a job at this urban Indian center. And he again talks about art and stories. He says the problem with Native art in general, this is on page 77, is that it's stuck in the past. The catch about the whole thing is this: if it isn't pulling from tradition, how is it native? If it's stuck in tradition in the past, how can it be relevant to other people living now? How can it be modern? Okay, all right. And each of the characters, in ways that I've already explained with a few of them, right, are interested in his or her heritage, right? Regardless of how they look. Some don't. Dean says he looks white, regardless of how they look. And a good example of that is Tony on page 26. He says when he puts on this Indian dancing costume, and he looks at his reflection in the TV, what he sees is Indian rather than the drone. Okay. Let me move this. Okay. So, allusions to the title was another question I asked you. All right. And so there are a couple here. On page 29, Dean, these are both in the Dean Oxendine chapter. He says at the very end of the long paragraph there, he says, Dean put his headphones on, shuffles the music on his phone, skips a few songs, and stays on There by Radiohead. The hook is, just 'cause you feel, it don't mean it's there. Before going underground between the Fruitdale and Lake Merritt stations, Dean looks over and sees the word, that name again, Lens. That's his tag there on the wall right before he goes under. So just because you feel it doesn't mean it's there. And the question is, what does that mean, and how does it relate? How does it relate to a theme or themes in the novel? Just because you feel it doesn't mean it's there. I don't know. Just because you feel what? Just because you feel native? Just because you feel lost? I'm not sure. Okay. The second quote's a little clearer to me. Gertrude Stein, everybody's autobiography, on pages 28 to 29. Oh, wait a minute. I thought it was 28 to 29. Sorry. 38 to 39. I'm sorry. This is from Gertrude Stein lived in Oakland, and she writes in this book, there's no there, right? And what she's referring to is going home. Once she goes back to Oakland, she lived in Europe for a long time. She lived in Paris with not with Hemingway, but the same time that he lived there. And the connection on page 39, first paragraph that Dean makes, he goes, the quote is important to Dean, this there. He hadn't read Stein beyond the quote, but for Native people in the country all over America, it's been developed over buried land, glass and concrete and wire and steel, unreturnable covered memory. There is no there. Okay, so finally, what should we notice so far? A couple things. This idea that I think one of the things that Orange is doing in the book is asking, what is a native? What is an American Indian, right? Or a Native American, or whatever term you use. And one of the things he suggests is we are what our ancestors did, okay, on page 10. Another point he seems to make again and again, given always this kind of connection between Indians and the land, he says being Indian has never been about returning to the land. The land is everywhere or nowhere. Okay, again, relating back to Gertrude Stein's quote, there's no there. Seems another thing that Orange is asserting is the importance of stories, right? Telling, it's exactly what he's doing. He has his characters telling stories, and Dean has the video project, and that's exactly what Orange is doing in this novel. The importance of stories that aren't sad and pathetic or stuck in the past, okay, that are relevant to today's contemporary Native Americans. And then finally, just kind of the acknowledgement, right? Again, going back to this image of the decapitated Indian, the rolling head, this idea that all the characters we meet here, almost all of them in this book, are wounded in some way, either physically, right, or psychologically or emotionally. All right, thank you for listening.